The Roman Empire was one of the empires with the largest territorial extent in world history. However, this magnificent empire was built entirely upon the system of slavery. Rome's victories, territorial conquests, and prosperity rose on the shoulders of millions of chained slaves. One of these slaves was Spartacus, who launched the greatest slave revolt in history against the Roman Empire. Spartacus was a Thracian soldier who had served in the Roman army before being enslaved. One day, when the Roman Empire ordered him to attack his own people, he refused to obey his commander. He fled, was captured, and enslaved. He was sold to a ruthless man named Lentulus Batiatus, who ran a gladiator school in Capua. When he joined the school, everyone who saw him immediately realized that he was different. In training, he fought against masters and impressed both gladiators and instructors alike. In a short time, he became a leader in the eyes of the other slaves and gained fame throughout Capua. This fame even reached Rome. Because of the success of his gladiators, Batiatus was invited one day to a combat event in Rome. He planned to select his best gladiators and send them to Rome to fight before the public. This meant death for Spartacus and the others, because in Roman spectacles there was no mercy for defeated gladiators. For Spartacus, who constantly thought about escape, this was the final straw. Together with his close friends Crixus, Oenomaus, Castus, and Gannicus, he prepared an escape plan. Their goal was to break their chains before stepping into the Roman arena. On a summer night in 73 BCE, the plan was put into action. Initially, 200 gladiators were expected to join the revolt. However, the plan had been leaked, and the guards were alerted. Still, 70 gladiators remained loyal to the plan. They had only kitchen knives, clubs, and stones in their hands. The guards were quickly neutralized one by one. The gladiators seized the armory, armed themselves with swords, and left Capua. The escape plan had succeeded, and the revolt had officially begun. Spartacus and his companions took refuge on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius to avoid being easily found. This place, located in southern Italy, surrounded by olive groves and rocky terrain, was like a natural fortress. At first there were only 70 of them, but as news of the revolt spread, slaves from Capua and its surroundings began to flee their masters and climb the mountain in waves. In a short time the number of rebels reached the thousands. In Rome, the authorities initially did not take the news from the Capua school seriously. The Senate saw it as a simple slave uprising and thought, it will last 3 to 5 days. Therefore, the first person assigned to deal with it was a nobleman with no military experience, Gaius Claudius Glaber. He was given an army of 3,000 men. However, these were not experienced soldiers, but newly trained ordinary troops. Some were volunteers, but their mission was simple: to surround Spartacus and his men who had fled to the summit of Mount Vesuvius, starve them into submission, and force their surrender. Mount Vesuvius was high and steep. Glaber had blocked the only exit route. However, Spartacus and his men circled around behind Glaber's camp and launched a sudden attack. Panic broke out among the Roman soldiers. Unprepared for battle, Glaber's army was destroyed before it even understood what was happening. As swords shattered Roman armor, the slaves' dream of freedom grew stronger than ever. The destruction of Glaber's army was a humiliation for Rome. The situation was no longer just a gladiator revolt, but had turned into a direct challenge to Roman authority. After news of the victory of Vesuvius spread, slaves from all over Rome broke their chains and joined Spartacus's ranks. Spartacus's army grew day by day. Their numbers rose to 5,000, then 10,000, then 30,000. Yet most of these people had never held a sword before and knew nothing about warfare. Spartacus, together with his capable commander Crixus, established a military order. He banned looting and imposed discipline on the slave army. The Roman Empire was no longer facing a small rebellion, but a mass movement spreading across Italy. The Senate, unwilling to risk another humiliation, formed a new army under the command of 2 important consuls, Verinius and Cosinius, and sent them against the rebels. Upon receiving this news, Spartacus divided his army into smaller groups and set ambushes for the Roman units. Cosinius's army was completely annihilated in a sudden night raid near Capua. Shortly after, Verinius's forces were also trapped on a dense forest road and destroyed. Serious panic broke out in the Senate. Rome's rural areas were burning, roads were being closed, and trade had come to a standstill. Spartacus and his army had captured many cities such as Capua, Nola, Campania, Metapontum, and Thurii. Moreover, the slaves of these cities joined him. and within a year the size of the slave army had reached up to 80,000. This was almost 1/4 of the Roman army. Despite having such power, Spartacus's goal was never to seize Rome. His aim was to cross the Alps, return to his homeland of Thrace, and live free there. However, not everyone around him shared this vision. Some sought plunder, while others wanted revenge against Rome. One of those with whom he disagreed was his comrade, the Gallic warrior Crixus. Crixus wanted to march into the heart of the empire, capture the city, and force Rome to kneel. The debates dragged on, no agreement was reached, and eventually the army split in two. Spartacus marched north with the main force of about 50,000 men, while Crixus remained in the south with 30,000 warriors. This division was an opportunity the Roman Senate could not miss. They acted without delay. A Roman army of 40,000 experienced soldiers, commanded by the famous politician and general Gellius, advanced south. Near Mount Gargan, the two sides confronted each other. Crixus and his men were exhausted from a long march. Nevertheless, the slave army launched the first attack, yet each time they were repelled, as if they had crashed into a wall. Crixus's men gradually began to collapse against Rome's professional soldiers. With Crixus's death, the now leaderless slave army was completely destroyed. Another Roman army moved north to prevent Spartacus from reaching the Alps. The plan was to trap the rebels between two armies and annihilate them. However, Spartacus blocked the Roman advance in a valley of the Apennine Mountains near Pisa. After a fierce battle, the Roman army was largely destroyed. The few surviving soldiers in Glaber were forced to flee. Following this victory, Spartacus marched against the second commander, Gellius, and met him at Ambia. Spartacus and his army won that battle, and like Glaber, Gellius fled the battlefield. The two defeated Roman generals gathered their remaining troops and attacked Spartacus once more, but they lost again. As a result, the Senate dismissed both generals from duty. In the eyes of the Senate, there was only one man who could erase this disgrace: Crassus. He was Rome's wealthiest man, a politician, and a brutally ruthless general who would go down in history. A 50,000-strong army was immediately placed under the command of Marcus Crassus. Crassus positioned his forces south of the Alps. Although Spartacus tried to break through Crassus's lines, he failed in battle. After losing 6,000 men in the fighting against Crassus, he began to withdraw his army southward. His troops were exhausted, so Spartacus decided to cross to the island of Sicily. Sicily was Rome's grain storehouse and had experienced many slave revolts before. If he could reach the island, he might ignite a new wave of rebellion and perhaps drag Rome into a years-long civil war. For this purpose, he made a deal with pirates to transport his army across the sea. They camped at Ricoa and waited for the pirates, but the pirates took the gold they were paid and fled, abandoning Spartacus. Realizing this too late, Spartacus found himself trapped in a narrow area of southern Italy. Meanwhile, Crassus built an extraordinary defensive line to encircle him. At the narrowest point of the toe of the boot, he constructed a 60-kilometer-wide fortification system. It was reinforced with trenches and walls, and the Roman navy also blockaded them from the sea. Thus Spartacus and his army were isolated both on land and by sea. As days passed, hunger set in and morale began to collapse. Nevertheless, Spartacus and his men managed to break through the defensive line with a sudden night attack. As they fled north, Crassus pursued them. In addition, the famous Roman general Pompey and the Macedonian consul Lucullus were also marching with their armies to assist Crassus. Spartacus headed toward Brindisi, planning to cross to the opposite shore from there. But when they arrived, they saw that Lucullus had already landed. Their plan collapsed. As a last resort, Spartacus sent a letter to Crassus seeking negotiation, but Crassus rejected it. Spartacus then moved his army toward northern Campania, only to find his path blocked once again by Pompey and his forces. The year was 71 BCE, near the Silarus River. Spartacus and Crassus faced each other one final time. The slave army numbered about 50,000. Their morale was shaken, but they were still free. Spartacus stood before his men and gave a final speech. "Today we will either walk out of here as men born free or die as free warriors. Rome made us slaves, but we will decide our own fate." After his speech, Spartacus and his fighters charged at the Roman army. The battle was horrific. Every slave attack shattered against Roman lines like waves against a wall. As losses mounted, Spartacus drew his sword and charged toward Crassus's headquarters. He killed 2 high-ranking officers, but could not reach Crassus. When Spartacus's guards were slain, he was surrounded by Roman soldiers. He fought heroically, but did not survive. the slave army quickly collapsed. In this final battle, about 50,000 slaves lost their lives, while the Roman army suffered 12,000 casualties. General Crassus crucified 6,000 rebels along the road to Rome as a warning to others. Rome had won once again, yet Spartacus's revolt left an unforgettable mark. The fact that Spartacus's body could not be found despite months of searching made his legend even greater. Some believed he had survived the battle and vanished without a trace. Though Rome tried to erase his name, Spartacus was written into history in golden letters as a champion of freedom. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.